Hello, the podcast that I'm now starting is a mixture of the book that I wrote, along with hopefully some clarifications along the way. Book 1 in the series, Life Beyond Silence, is titled Not a Victim, a Survivor, Life Beyond Domestic Violence and Rape, and it's available on Amazon. I'm hoping that in this podcast I can tell my story in my own words and can elaborate on some of what I've learned as I've grown older. Plus, I have 2 other books that I hope within this process I can finalize and publish on Amazon as well. So, let's get started. I think the first episode of this podcast is probably going to be the hardest for me. Just trying to get into the groove of it and get across everything I want to say. So please bear with me. Again, the book is titled Not a Victim, a Survivor, Life Beyond Domestic Violence and Rape. So in the beginning, I wanted to write a letter to the readers of my book in hopes of speaking to anyone that ever was or now is in a similar relationship or a similar situation, I guess you would say. I wanted them to know they're not alone and that I'm hoping that my story in some way touches them and that they grow stronger along the way and, like myself, refuse to be a victim anymore. So here goes. The letter, as I put in my book, started off by saying, "You don't know me. After all, I'm no one special. But if you take the time to read my book, you will have seen inside my soul like no one else has." This book is just one part of a series based on my life, and I poured my heart into it. You will learn that although I am nobody to you, I am indeed someone special, and I hope that my story will touch your heart. I've dealt with rape, physical and mental abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction. I went from a dysfunctional family through 4 failed marriages. However, through it all, I can honestly say that I've learned a lot about who I am as a person. I've cried an endless amount of tears and felt incredible pain. I've had thoughts of suicide many times, and yet I'm still here. And that kind of summarizes it. I'm still here. I don't know if my story will help anyone, but if you or someone you love is living with abuse and reads this and realizes that they're not alone in the world and they don't have to be a victim, but they can hold their head up and come out of the darkness as a survivor, then I will truly be happy. May God bless you and keep you. It's the kind of letter that whoever reads my story or is now listening to my story, that they're not alone. And I know how it feels to be a victim and not want to be. After all, it's hard for me to think of anyone that's going through what I went through, whether it's mental or physical, any kind of abuse, and know that nobody wants to be in that situation. But sometimes you think, or at least I thought, that in some way I deserved it. Or it wasn't as bad as some of the stories that I had heard about. So therefore the dysfunction, verbal and emotional abuse, it just didn't seem like, well, like walking on eggshells was okay in some way. Livable abuse even though you didn't want it to be that way. You didn't want to live that way. I was doing okay handling it and trying my best to make it better. You just keep giving chances after chances to whoever's hurting you. That one day it'll just turn around and magically it'll be different, especially if they're saying they're sorry, or you think that the fact that there are good moments along the way, along with bad moments, you're still constantly weighing, is it more good than bad? And if it is, and the good outweighs the bad, you just keep trying. You just keep pushing yourself to stay, and maybe things will change. I don't know. I just wanted to let everyone out there know that they're not alone and they too can survive. They can get out, they can turn their lives around, not only for them, but for their children. Anyway, I should start at the beginning and take a look back at my life. It is, however, interesting that I survived with most of my sanity. If I've learned anything from my life, it would be that at times I molded myself into a pattern I couldn't even see until I stopped and took a good look, a good hard look, where I've been. I guess I would say I found similarities in my life that should have warned me to stay away. But perhaps I was warned, and I just refused to listen. And that one section basically sums it up for me. I know I made a lot of mistakes, and I chose a lot of paths that were wrong for me. And I hate to say it, but sometimes I could see ahead in the past that it was the wrong path to take. But I still went that way. I think for most of my life, I've had this need to find happiness, love. And I thought that if I could find that in a relationship, or at least that's what I thought. In my head, it was like if you find a guy and you fall in love, the kind of love you so desperately wanted, the white picket fence, happiness, security, you just want it all. And I think there were times that I saw the road ahead of me and just thought maybe it's not perfect. Maybe there are warning signs, red flags, but you just want it so badly that your thinking does the good outweigh the bad. But it doesn't work like that. I know that now. And I wish I'd known that then. I wish I'd been braver then, because now, after all these years, I am brave. And I think I am more cautious, maybe. I am safer because I'm more cautious. Back then, I just jumped in. I just wanted it so bad that I was willing to dodge the few red flags if that's what it took to possibly have happiness that I was looking for. Of course, it never worked out that way. Anyway, so let's just start my story. And I'm just kind of winging it. Everyone filling in stories that might have been left out of the book. After all, the book was written a long time ago. I don't know if the podcast is going to be better than the book, but at least you'll be getting a few details along the way. Anyway, so in chapter 1, how it all began, I was born in 1960 to a 16-year-old girl, and my father was only 18, which unfortunately I have gotten that wrong because my father's now corrected that and said he turned 19 right after I was born. And that makes sense. I was born on the 25th and he was born on the 29th of December. So, anyway, what I remember most about my mom is that all my life I heard her say that she could have really done something with her life, but she got pregnant with me. And back then, if you were pregnant, you dropped out of school, you got married, you went to work to support the child. I think for both of them, it was hard. Young people, as they were, it was just what people did in their situation. And they ended up staying together for many years. But I believe, I don't know, I was like 17 when they divorced, or at least it was when they finished the divorce, which I think that was hard too. I know that when you're with a person for all those years, plus I have a younger sister that's 9 years younger than me. Well, I felt like they didn't see it coming. And then there it was. And finally they were divorced. And I'm from a small rural community, so I think, like as many people do when they divorce, some people would side with my dad, supporting him, and some people sided with my mom, supporting her. Needless to say, it wasn't simple. It was a hard divorce. After all, there was a lot to sort out. It was, as I remember, a very difficult time. Getting back to my story, I don't think my mother or father would have ever even married if it hadn't been for her getting pregnant with me. And I don't blame my mother for feeling the way that she did. Like I said, she had her whole life in front of her, and it could have been much, it couldn't have been much fun learning that you're pregnant, especially since I was born on Christmas Day and she was only 16. I'm sure I wasn't the present she'd hoped for. I've always heard from my grandparents and my mother that my mom had been rushing around all day, cleaning and delivering presents to people. And as she settled down for the night, she soon realized that she might need to go to the hospital. I think she'd been having a lot of back pain, and I was told she woke them up and, told them they needed to take her to the hospital. So my grandmother and my grandfather took her. Anyway, at some point, I always believed I was born at 4 a.m. on Christmas morning. And after they'd been there for quite some time, I can only imagine how she felt after having a baby when they said they were going to go home and eat something and open presents. She probably did feel slighted. After all, it's one of the major holidays, and to a young girl, she probably felt very alone. I've never known everything about when I was young, but my mother said it was rough for her and my dad in the beginning. I think they were even separated for a time when I was an infant. I know my mother stayed with my grandparents, and my mother said she used to dress me like a little doll, and her friends would come over to see me. I heard my grandfather even went after her one time when she went to the movies and made her come home to take care of me. It couldn't have been easy. My dad, on the other hand, was really never, or has really never, told me a lot about back then. He just told me he was trying to work and make money for mom and me. What amazes me is when you're young, you don't really remember much, only bits and pieces. And of course, you're told stories, things you may not have clear memories about because you were so little. So you really never know what happened or in what sequence. Sometimes I think grown-ups don't tell you that on purpose to keep the hardships to themselves. So you kind of have to feel your way through life and endure things, learn lessons all on your own. Things that they learned, but they just didn't talk about, I guess. Anyway, I'm sure what the first thing I remember, or at least the sequences are jumbled, so I'll just tell you. I remember President Kennedy was shot, and watching the parade procession of him riding in the car with his wife, and seeing the shot ring out, and then seeing the newsman cry while he's telling us that he's trying to learn the president's condition. I remember my mother sitting down in a chair crying and staring at the TV. And then the newsman came back on and broke it to everyone that President Kennedy had died. And my mother's tears and how they just kept repeating the footage. I remember the procession of his funeral and Jackie Kennedy and her two children, the horses pulling the casket draped in a flag. I also remember the Apollo space missions and getting a very large replica of the Apollo rocket. It had boosters that fell away. It had the middle section that opened along with the capsule at the top that they would eventually splash down in. I remember playing with it and opening all the little compartments and then putting it back together and it being almost as big as I was. I also got a little white vanity once. I don't know why it stands out in my head, but the vanity from my grandparents, I remember I was so excited to play with it. After all, vanities were kind of big back then, and maybe they still are. And this one had a mirror and compartments in which to store your hairbrush and makeup. Pretend, of course, pretend makeup. My grandfather was literally everything to me when I was small. He was a police officer, that was his job, but he was an artist as well, painting and drawing anything you might want. Although he never pushed himself to develop his art, it was his hobby and one that I dearly loved. He used to come to school to pick me up and he would draw on every kid's notebook in the class pictures of what they might want. From what I remember, most of it was Disney characters. My memory of him drawing, especially at Christmas time, was that he was kind of like Norman Rockwell. He could make the whole neighborhood in awe of his talent. He also did voices, or at least for me, he did voices. I remember he convinced me that he knew Mickey Mouse, and he would talk and play around with throwing his voice. It was like he was magical, and he shared with me his special friendship with Mickey Mouse and other Disney characters. He was so imaginative. At least to me, he was. And I have so many fond memories of him playing with me. I never called him grandfather or grandpa. To me, he was Papa. And my grandmother was Memo. And it's funny because my grandson now is only 3 years old and he calls me Memo sometimes, along with Grandma and Nana. He definitely makes my eyes light up when he says Memo. And it's funny how he is the apple of my eye, just as I was the apple of my papa's eye once upon a time. I have a total of 5 grandchildren, and my grandson is the littlest and the one I definitely have been around the most, taking care of him while his mom and dad worked since I no longer worked. My papa was everything to me, and I'm sure I was everything to him. I just remember he always made me laugh and smile. One time he bought me a pony when I was little, and I remember it was black and white, and I called him Little Joe because I always watched Ponderosa, and Little Joe was one of the characters. But I used to watch it all the time with my grandfather, and I even had a little cowgirl outfit. And every time I would ride Little Joe, it was kind of like a circle that I rode him in. And when I would come around to where his water and his food was, he would take off, and I'd be on top screaming, barely holding on. I was probably 8 or 9 years old then, and I also remember him giving me a German Shepherd named Rex and telling me that he would protect me. I remember being convinced in some sort of way that it was a police dog, maybe, that my grandfather had gotten a hold of. After all, he was a policeman. And I remember he was very protective of me. One time, my mother and me were outside. We used to live in a trailer, and we were on the porch, and a woman came up who was a friend of my mother's. And as she was coming up to the trailer that we lived in, she was, hollering and waving her hands. And my mother looked at Rex and said, "Sicker." And all of a sudden, Rex was on her, like just ran straight for her and bit her leg. I remember it was supposed to be a joke, but it wasn't funny. And Rex did what my mother had told him to do, but she scolded him anyway. The next thing I remember was my mother said he was hit by a car. And Rex did have a large gash above his eye. And then suddenly he wasn't around. It hurts to know, or let me say this, it hurts not to know of what happened to him. I just know that he got hit by a car, and then I no longer saw him there. My Uncle Larry was another part of the family that I was really close to, especially during my pre-teenage years. He was a very large man, 6'4", and over 500 pounds, morbidly obese. But I loved him, and I felt as though I was really his only true friend. We hung out together, listened to music. He was really a great guy. And my mother and even my grandfather teased him about his food consumption, which I thought only made it worse because he seemed to eat even more when they were teasing him and picking at him. Hold on a second. I gotta. Okay, I'm back. So I remember watching TV with my Uncle Larry. I loved him so much. He was like a big brother to me. He always told me how he felt inside. We would talk about everything. He even did like a school assembly one time and when I was in middle school talking about illegal substances, drugs. After all, my Uncle Larry was on the police force and worked in narcotics. You might wonder why I'm talking about my papa and my Uncle Larry so much. I really believe that my parents kind of drifted away from me in those years. Perhaps it was because they both worked, or because my sister was born, or because I was everything in my papa and Uncle Larry's eyes. After all, to them, I could do no wrong. When I was home, I had to compete with my sister for attention. And it always, hold on a minute, hit the button again. After all, when I was home, I had to compete with my sister for my parents' attention. And it always seemed as though I was in trouble. At my papa's, I didn't have any problems getting attention. Like I said, my papa was a gifted man and well thought of. And the best thing was he was only a phone call away whenever I needed him. I remember watching him get ready for work, holstering his gun, and getting into his squad car. To me, Papa was everything. Anytime I would call him, he would come get me. He would come to my school. He met all my friends. It was great. I mean, it was amazing. My Uncle Larry, on the other hand, like I said, he was over 500 pounds. And for as long as I can remember, he had nobody but me by his side. I even got jealous when he talked to girls. I was kind of rude to them, I have to admit. I once told He once told me that I had nothing to worry about because nobody wanted him as fat as he was. I remember that crushed me. I knew my uncle was a loving, caring man, and if a woman could only see what I saw, they would have thought themselves lucky to have him. I also knew that if he ever had kids, he would have been the best dad in the world. My uncle taught me things and gave me warnings on drugs, boys, peer pressure. He had opinions on everything. He would listen to what I had to say, and I felt like he was my only friend and confidant, just like I was for him. I remember everyone teasing him about his eating. Like I said, my grandfather and my grandma and my mother were pretty rough on him. He would sit down and gorge himself on food, drank like a whole carton of Pepsi. My mom said he should try to suffer through his cravings and lose weight, and I'm sure that was true, but it made him eat more. And sometimes when we were out, I would go into restaurants to get carry-out orders for him. He might be there for 3 or 4 hours driving around, and he would eat while he was driving, trying to like get whatever he wanted down before he took me back to the house so they wouldn't see how much he had eaten. I can still remember my papa calling me the apple of his eye, and that wherever I would go in life, he would always be there for me. I'm sure people might say I was a spoiled kid, but I disagree. I don't remember, I mean, I know I got material things. I know I did, but I don't remember ever being that attached to them. It was like the pats on the back and the shoulder to cry on meant more to me. The hugs, the kisses. I just remember my mom always made me mad as a young girl because she'd never kissed me on the lips. She always turned her cheek. I would even try to hold her face to try to get a kiss in. I grew up thinking that she didn't love me, that she was cold, that we would never have a relationship that I so longed for. My dad taunted me as a young girl, and he teased me about everything: my dress, my perfume, my attempt at makeup, even my friends. One time I remember my mother let me have this party, and I don't remember how old I was. I would say maybe it was after we moved into our house, so probably 11, 12. Black girl and a boy came, maybe even two black boys. And dad finally came home. It was just a small party, dancing, you know, cake, cookies, whatever. And when my dad came home, he totally lost it. That was the first time I ever really saw prejudice, something I'd never considered until then. After all, I always remember being around black maids that my grandparents would have at my grandmother's house. And I know as a baby I had a black nanny. I never thought of them as anything other than family because we treated them like family. My grandfather, my grandmother, my uncle, even my mom. But that was what was so weird. Why was my dad losing it? The party broke up quickly and everyone left, but I was embarrassed. My dad had even used the N word. Even if no one else heard him, it hurt me. I felt, I don't know, it hurt me that he felt that way towards kids he didn't even know.